On the western edge of Weymouth there lies a rocky outcropping that points protectively towards Portland Harbour, and perched on top of it there sits a three-tiered fortress known to all as the Nothe Fort. First built in 1872 to defend against the possibility of French invasion, it stood manned for the better part of 80 years before its decommissioning and decades of dereliction that finally ended with its transformation into a museum of coastal defence. Nowadays, those who visit are greeted with a friendly smile, handed a pamphlet and allowed to explore each of its levels, from the magazines below to the ramparts above. There's plenty to see as well, from the Bofors guns that took down the Luftwaffe to the statues of Victorian gunners decked out in the Tattenbrowns' finest. Down on the lower levels, though, between the rooms that held all manner of powder and projectile, lies a long dark passageway that to this day lies unlit and sparsely used. A passage that few people choose to walk through, as those who do often hear a distant whistling tune creeping ever closer, and an unsettling chillness slides slowly up their spine. Course, some just put it down to the strange acoustics of tunnels and the drafts that circulate old buildings. Most of us locals know what it is though, even if we don't admit to believe in it. After all, hauntings aren't especially uncommon in the West Country, and the spirit in that tunnel does have a better story than most. You see, though the Nothe was first garrisoned by men of the No. 2 Battery, the Royal Artillery, it quickly became clear that the perceived threat that had spurred its construction was no longer present, if indeed it ever had been. Consequently, its operation and stewardship was transferred to a force of local volunteers who were duly dubbed the 1st Dorsetshire Royal Garrison Artillery. Course, in them days there wasn't much more to do than run drills, clean the guns and generally keep the place in good order. While His Majesty's Navy docked at Portland certainly needed protecting, any threat of foreign invasion was laughably small given the fact that back then Britannia most assuredly ruled the waves and there was little chance of any foreign aggressor getting near enough to do much damage at all. Nevertheless, the local men who served at the Nothe were rightly held in high regard, and so the 1st Dorsetshire RGA never had any shortage of volunteers. One of these was a man named George who signed up for home service back in 1908, hoping for little more than a bit of excitement in the respect of his peers. Though he'd not had much of an education, he could read and he could write, and he was a dab hand with his numbers, which was a rarity for a working man back then. So, in due course he rose from private to corporal to sergeant, and in his senior position he took great pride in the fact that the gun crew he oversaw was by far the fastest and most efficient. Course, those of you that know your history know that the relative peace of 1908 would soon be shattered by the Kaiser's assaults on France and Belgium. Come 1914, the Nothe Battery was again put on high alert, ready to defend Dorset shores from the dreadnoughts and the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine. However, after 2 years of standing sentry, no such attack had been launched, and soon the gunners in George's crew began to feel they were of little use where they were. So, when the generals appealed for artillerymen to volunteer for service in France, George and his crew promptly joined the 174th Siege Battery, just in time for the Somme. Given that their task was to pound the German trenches with heavy howitzers and create the rolling barrage that covered the infantry's advance, George and his lads were lucky enough to avoid the worst of the carnage at the front and could do little more than pity the poor souls who wandered back, broken and bloodied. Though the Somme was his first battle, it was sadly not his last. But as his time in France passed, the skills he demonstrated in commanding his gun crew earned him some renown amongst the officers, and soon enough he and his crew were requested for more specialised and dangerous work that eventually led them to Passchendaele. There's not a lot I can tell you about Passchendaele that hasn't already been said. If the name's familiar to you, then you'll know what sort of battle it was. If it isn't, then it's enough to say that Passchendaele is as close to man as ever come to creating hell on earth. Whole towns were reduced to ashes and dust, while great forests were turned to matchwood, and the very earth itself was transformed into a sucking quagmire that would drown any man who put a foot wrong. An obscenity created by the guns that pounded away ceaselessly. As with all battles, ground was gained and ground was lost, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly. So while gunners like George usually did their work behind the lines, the changing fortunes of war could at times leave them cut off and exposed with little warning. Being the observant man he was, it was George who saw the German regiment advance in that day, and it was he who quickly realised that they couldn't be stopped. Understanding the inevitable, one of the officers, a young lad a little older than 18, declared that he would stay to scupper the guns and cover their retreat while George led the men back to safety. He was a good lad, brave, and despite his plummy speech and posh manners, he'd been accepted by most of the men. Problem was that he was the type who'd spent his youth on the cricket field and won his commission through nepotism rather than skill. Left to the task, he'd surely do his best and certainly die bravely, but it was almost certain he wouldn't do it right. So, slapping the officer on the shoulder, George told him that it was his gun and his job to do. Then he handed him his pocket watch, the only bit of finery he had, and told him to get his lads to safety. Knowing it was useless to argue when a Dorset man sets his mind to something, the young officer led the men away, trying his best not to look back but finding himself unable to resist just the same. After finding paltry shelter in a shell crater, he watched as George stuffed the gun barrels with Mills bombs, took a shovel to the firing pins, and rendered them useless right before the German bayonet pierced his back and ended his life. The young officer was lucky that night to find a small patch of ground amongst what remained of a copse of trees, somewhere just out of sight of the advancing German forces, where they could at least remain unseen for an hour or two. He was sure then that it was only a matter of time before they were either slaughtered or captured and considered surrender more than once. But just past midnight, the strangest thing happened. As he was staring out into the nighttime gloom, he heard the strangest whistling, and then turned to see a figure draped in tattered British battle dress emerge from the mist. At first he thought it was just a shadow, a coincidental accumulation of smoke and darkness, but the closer he looked, the clearer it became. He never saw the spectre's face, obscured as it was by a veil of opaque nothingness, but when the figure raised its hand and pointed towards the horizon, he couldn't help but trust it. If you'd asked him why he woke the men and commanded them to follow, he couldn't have told you why. It's certain that he had heard stories from older men who'd served at Mons and Arras, stories of angels appearing in the sky, of ethereal archers and figures that led men away from danger. But truth be told, it was little more than desperation. In the absence of hope, you'll cling to whatever chance you can for survival, even if it can't be explained. So, on faith and hope alone, he followed the figure, all the while listening intently for that strange whistling and the sight of the spectre in the distance. By the time the daybreak came, the officer and the ragged men that followed him had trudged through every type of fetid horror the battlefield could offer, yet nonetheless arrived safe and sound at the nearest British trench. The officer stepped up then. Having gained the reputation of a saviour, he lived up to the acclaim that followed, and as his confidence grew, so did his talents as a commander. He was lucky too. Whenever a situation looked inescapable, he'd always seem to find a way out of it, almost as if he had a guardian angel. So, unlike so many others of that generation, he survived and lived to return home. Once the war was done, he returned home to his family's estate, and for many months said nothing of the war. When his nieces and nephews asked him for war stories, he'd simply say, "I pray you never know." One night, though, he was standing in his study staring out of his window when he heard soft footprints behind him and turned to see his sister in the doorway. "There's something you need to tell me," she said, with that certainty and authority that older siblings often have. And so, unable to lie or minimise the mental turmoil that was obvious to all those around him, the stories poured out. The blood, the devastation, the panic, the fear, all of it. And then, at the end, he told her all about the whistling ghost that kept him safe and guided him home. Like many young ladies of her generation, his sister had become fascinated by the occult during the war, enraptured by practitioners such as Oliver Lodge and Gladys Leonard, fascinated by the work of Aleister Crowley. Over the preceding years, a new wave of spiritualism had grasped the imagination of a broken country, still haunted by the shadow of death and grieving for loved ones. Many seized upon any chance, no matter how slim and fleeting, to commune with those they had lost. So, where others may have dismissed his tale as the ramblings of a shell-shocked soldier, his sister simply listened. Then, when he had finished, she simply asked him, "Have you thanked him yet?" The lad spluttered then and turned shamefaced. It wasn't that he'd never shown appreciation or said the words thank you, but he'd never done much more than that, never paid more than lip service to the gratitude he owed. He'd not even returned the watch. So, along with his sister, he committed to do exactly that, and to ensure that George's wife was given a final, meaningful farewell. Although he'd spent the last few months on extended leave, his commission was still active, and given both his war record and his family connections, he could request any posting he desired. So, while his superiors thought it strange that someone so highly decorated should wish to command a coastal defence battery, they nonetheless assented and duly appointed him to command the Nothe. Upon reaching the fort, he went about completing all of the duties expected of a new commander, including seeing to the arrangements for the annual service of remembrance. As with many other such services, he made sure to invite all the local dignitaries as well as any servicemen who'd survived the maelstrom, but uncommonly, he reserved the choicest seat not for the mayor or the local MP, but for George's wife. Many of the fine ladies and gentlemen who surrounded her that day stared at her with barely concealed resentment and scoffed at the quality of her Sunday best, convinced as they were that they'd been snubbed by the expectation they should treat her as an equal. That was, of course, until our young officer stepped onto the stage and told everyone there what George had done that day at Passchendaele. Once the reverent silence was over and the solemn celebrations that followed began to wind down, he found George's wife in the crowd and informed her that the story wasn't over, that he had much more to tell and an item to return. Intrigued as much as she was confused, George's wife followed him and his sister to his office, where he handed her the watch and proceeded to tell her the story I'd just told you. How George had returned as a spirit and guided them off the battlefield, how he'd returned 100 times to keep him safe, and finally, how he wished to give her the gift of a final goodbye. Throughout the tale, George's wife sat stoically, shaking her head from side to side, staring at the floor in disbelief before finally asking how. Taking her hands in a friendly grasp, the officer's sister knelt beside her and said, "There are times when the dead are closer to us than we realise, and tonight is one of those nights. Come back here at midnight and the guard will let you pass. Then we'll make sure you get your goodbye." When George's wife returned at the allotted time, she did as she was instructed and was guided to a small room deep in the lowest levels of the fort where they would not be disturbed. There, in the centre of the room, the sister sat across from them at a circular table covered with a deep red cloth, adorned with a single dim lantern. In front of her lay a large leather-bound book inscribed with strange archaic markings, and over her shoulders lay an iridescent shawl that seemed to move of its own accord. After polite greetings were exchanged, they all took their places and joined in as the sister began a low, sombre reading of the text in front of her. There was no way they could have known the meaning of the words they were reciting, as they were a strange, unpredictable blend of Gallic, Arabic, Old English, Low German, and a dozen other dialects that defied expectation or identification. Nevertheless, the words flowed from each of them as if they'd known them since childhood, and as they spoke, they joined hands to form an unbroken circle of flesh. As the reading continued, the words seemed to take form and reverberate around the room, bouncing off the walls like knives, causing them to hum with ever-increasing intensity. Soon after, the flame in the lantern began to dance, eddying this way and that, one moment swelling to the peak of intensity, the next dimming to all but a whisper. Then, just as they were sure that the flame was finally about to extinguish itself, a great torrent of flame shot upwards, transforming the ceiling into a lake of unnatural fire that illuminated the room in a proxy of daylight. Under the glare of that deviant light, the sister began to recite one word alone in hacking, guttural spurts. "Return," she said. "Return, return, return, return," over and over again until the flames above them spat themselves out and they sat silent, unmoving, in the deepest, blackest darkness any of them had known. Then, quite unexpectedly, the silence was broken, not by a bang or by a rapping of knuckles, but by an unseen figure whistling a strange but familiar tune. I don't know what goodbyes were said that day, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. That's a private matter between husband and wife. However, I will tell you that from that day forth, anyone who found themselves walking those corridors alone in darkness would hear an unseen figure whistling behind them. So, if you ever do find yourself walking around the lower levels of the Nothe fort and you hear it yourself, don't be afeard. It's only George making sure you get out safe.